So the very first week, can anyone give me a quick 30-second or less recap over what we covered in the very first week of class?
Our mission
Yeah.
and how our service should be applied to every area.
Yeah, right on. That was it. So, thank you. I'm paid attention. What about week 2? Can anyone give me kind of a recap like that real quick? Yep.
The personalities.
Yeah, how was it?
Personalities, kind of how this is that.
Image of God. Image of God. Good job, guys. What about week 3, last week?
Conflict management.
Good job.
Yeah.
Has anyone had to use conflict management?
All the time.
Even better, you guys are applying what we're learning. So today, like it says on the screen, we're talking about time management and values. So whether we realize it or not, kind of why we're putting these two together is that our values dictate how we use our time. And if we kind of don't know what we value, then we can take a good look at our time and we can probably figure it out. There are some caveats to it. You know, there might be things we value that we don't have time for right now. But for the most part, if you're confused about what you value or how you're using your time, you can look at one of those 2 areas and you can probably figure it out. So we're actually going to hop right into our Bible story this time. Luke 10:38 through 42. And personally, I love this story for a lot of reasons. One of them is I hardcore relate to Martha. Like anytime I need a Jesus slap, I can read this story and like Jesus shows me all of his love and his grace and like lifts me up out of what I'm trying to do out of my own power and ability. And so I love this because I relate to Martha so much and I love seeing how just Jesus responds in love to her. The other beautiful thing is like the context of this passage is just really sweet and rich and brings a lot of meaning to the story. It's in the period of Luke. Luke structures his book, and he has a really long period where Jesus is kind of on a road trip with the people who followed him. And they're heading up to Jerusalem, I believe, for his final Passover. So he's getting ready to be crucified. And he's telling them all these parables, all these stories. He's basically imparting his final word on how to live like he did on this earth. And so in the chapter 10 itself, it sets up 2 really important stories that kind of set up how the lens we might want to be having when we're reading the story of Mary and Martha. The first is Jesus sends out the 72, and the 72 followers were just supposed to go and prepare the way that Jesus was coming. They weren't supposed to really prepare for anything. They were just supposed to go and proclaim that Jesus was on his way. And so the commands in that, specifically in verses 5 through 8, they set up these expectations from hospitality. You know, Christians were to expect hospitality, and we're also to be extending hospitality to other people. And so that's one thing that's important to be keeping in mind as we get to the story at the end of the chapter. The second story that we tend to kind of skip over is the story of Jesus imparting like what the greatest commandments are and the Good Samaritan and stuff like that. And so in verse 27 we have this guy who stands up and he's like, hey, you know, what are the 2 greatest commandments, trying to trick Jesus. And Jesus is like, you know, the 2 greatest commandments are to love God with everything. If you ever have time to look up the Shema where Jesus is quoting, it's a really, really beautiful piece that just really sets our life in focus about what it means to truly love God and love others. And then the second thing Jesus says is to love others as yourself. And you know, part of me really wants to just dive in and cover those 2, just because there's so much. But we don't really have time to do much other than kind of just take a minute to rethink how we might tend to think of these things. So how I tend to approach the idea of loving God and loving others is kind of 2 different categories. You know, either I love God or I love others. And that's not necessarily what it means, you know. Most things in life actually look a lot more like this. You know, loving God involves loving others. Loving others stems from loving God. And, you know, there might be a very small part of your life where it's just loving God, you know, your personal relationship with him, that's prayer or Bible study or whatever. But most of your life, to show you love God, is showing you're loving other people. And if you're really loving God first, you're loving other people really well. And so the decisions you're making in life we tend to think of them as these either ors, either I love Jesus and make this decision, or I love people and make this decision. But usually it's a both and, because I love God and I want to follow his command to love people, I'll do this or say this or develop this attitude in my life. So taking both of those things into mind, this kind of expectation for hospitality, and Jesus is really his priorities of loving God and loving others. We're going to take a look at this story now and figure out what it has to say about values and time management. So does someone want to go ahead and read that out for us, 38 through 42?
As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner he was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details. There is only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her."
Thank you. So in light of what we've been talking about, and again, this is one passage where it's helpful to look at the Greek words and stuff like that, because they do give more meaning than what we see. But when we look at this, we can see first off that Jesus isn't necessarily critiquing what Martha's doing. The commands to serve are present not only in this passage, but it's present throughout the Bible. And the Greek word for serving that Martha uses and that Jesus uses in verse 40 is diakonia, I think is how you say it. But it's like basically where we get the word deacon. So you think of someone who's helping, in their context, the apostles, they were collecting and distributing charitable offerings. So, Martha's not just at home like cooking dinners and stuff like that. It's very possible she's actually out in her community being the hands and feet of Jesus when, Jesus wasn't able to be in their town of Bethany. So it's important to keep in mind, Jesus isn't necessarily critiquing what she's doing. What she's doing is exactly what Jesus commands. But what Jesus is pointing out to her is that how she's doing it is not his design for her. And it makes the point that it's not only crucial that we value the right things in life, but we value the right things in life in the right order. And that's why it's so important to remember the parable of the Good Samaritan and like the commands, the two greatest commands, love God and love others in that order. The Greek words, again, for distracted, for anxious, for troubled, your Bible might have different ones, but all their definitions have to do with things like too busy, really concerned with their self-interest, disquieted in mind. So somewhere along the way, we can kind of pick up from the language that's being used and things like that. Martha had shifted from loving God first and loving people second to loving people first and loving God second. And that's why when she's in the literal presence of Jesus, she's not sitting with him, she's out serving him. And so that's what Jesus is really getting at here. He wants to be the first priority in our life. And honestly, when we're living out of that place of loving others and then loving God, we're not really doing either of those very well. We can see in this passage, Martha, she's frustrated at Mary. She walks up to Jesus and demands he does things her way. Which, true story, we do when we're in that place where we are loving others more than we're loving our Lord. But when Jesus is saying Mary has chosen the good portion, it's not to give her a pass on, ever going out and doing what he has called her to do. But he's pointing out to Martha, like, look, Mary has chosen me first, and that will never be taken away from her. And then the other reason, it can kind of get depressing, for like, I find myself in that pattern way too often. The other reason I love this story and I love Martha is because in John's gospel, I believe it's chapter 11. That's the gospel, that's the chapter where Lazarus dies. And Jesus goes up to raise him from the dead. And Martha's the one who meets him and declares him as Messiah before he has ever done anything like raise him from the dead. And that just gives me hope that every single time my priorities get out of order, when I find myself loving people more than I'm loving the Lord, there's hope for me to reorder that. You know, I don't know enough to know chronologically where this story fits in conjunction to the one with Lazarus, but it gives you hope that even when your priorities get out of order, you can easily reorder them and come into, can switch it to loving the Lord first and loving others second. But something we all know is that it's super easy to get caught up in daily life and just, you know, forget those things, or even if we have our values right, we just might not be good at managing our time. Even if you consider yourself a planner like me, time management is still something you can struggle with. And so I want us to talk through just a couple of practical tools too. So now that we have the framework of it's important to value the right things for starters, like Martha was, but it's important to be valuing them in the right order, like Mary was. I want to talk through some tools that can help us. Because really, when we're talking about time management and stuff like that, and we're finding out we just can't get a hold of our time for some reason, either we're not valuing the things we say we do, so there's a little bit of a disconnection between what we think we value and what we actually value, or we just aren't managing the time well, and we aren't making place for the things we value, and that's a boundaries issue at the end of the day. We don't have good boundaries in place for us or others, or we just don't have a very clear goal of what we want to be using with the time that's available to us. So for me, what's really helpful in managing my time, because to be totally honest, I have to be very disciplined to manage my time, because otherwise, even though I do like to plan, I won't get it done. And so the two helpful things for me, honestly, are just like planners and lists. And that sounds really basic, but that's genuinely what helps me. And so, I'm sorry, I'm lost for a moment. I'm like trying to figure out what I remember. Okay, and you know, just because it works for me might not mean it works for you. That's okay. The point is that you want to be finding something that does work for you, especially if time management is something you're like just not good at. So when it comes down to filling a planner, I am super old school. I love the paper planners, and I brought mine up if you want to take a look at how I do things. Again, I feel like this process works really well for my brain, probably not for very many other people's. But you know, there are just some things in life that are non-negotiables you have to do. If you're a student, you have to go to school. Do not walk away and tell your parents you don't have to go to school. That's what you learned at DDI tonight. Not true. If you're a professional, you have to go to work. And we all have those things that we can't get out of that have time restraints on them. And so whenever you get a planner, those are the things you want to put down first. So for me, those are the things at the very bottom here. I don't put down my work hours just because those are set week to week to week, but if you did work a job where it wasn't set, you might want to do that first. Next, put down like any meetings or special events you have. You know, I put down all the meetings I have. Next at the bottom, I put down any, like if I go to like Maddie, one of the girls I hang out with, she had her senior night a couple weeks ago. I put that down, and so you know you want to put those down next. And then basically anything else you have left over is your free time. And so your free time, it can go really, really fast. But this is where knowing what you value in life is really helpful. If you know one of your values is, so I'm not going to use the Lord because I'm assuming y'all value the Lord. But say one of your values is spending time with, say you have an older brother or sister that they don't live with you, and so one of your values is getting lunch with them once a week. Something like that. That would be something you'd want to use that free time for And if you don't have a value, or even if you just don't have goals of what you want to use with that time, that makes that free time go really fast, and that gives you the illusion of I don't have time. It's because we're not using it right. So, free time and goals. I lost my train of thought. But essentially, if you do decide you want to use your free time to achieve a larger goal you have, there is a framework I like to use called SMART. Basically, it's just making sure when you're outlining your goals, you're outlining things that are achievable for you to do. The most frustrating things is to put a goal in place and then not be able to achieve it. And so these are frameworks that help you make sure that the goals you're achieving are things that you can do. So specific, it just means write down what you want to accomplish. And the more specific you can be about it, the better it is in the long run, the more likely you're going to attain it. Measurable, so how are you going to know when you've reached this goal? That's really important, especially if you set yourself a really long-term goal that you need to break down to smaller steps. Something that will let you know I'm working towards it is going to be, it's going to be a game changer. Attainable. So is this a goal that's possible for you to achieve in this season of life right now? If not, is it just something you might need to push off to another season of life, or is there something you can do to make it attainable? Relevant. How does this goal relate to your life? Again, this is where values come in super handy. If you know the things you value, that will make it a lot more relevant to your life. Versus if you try to just kind of set this oddball goal out there like, oh, well, I should be doing this thing, that's not going to give you a lot of motivation to keep going with it. And the last part is timeline. When do you want to accomplish this goal by? You know, some things that you want to accomplish, they have external deadlines, and then like you're done, you know. That is your deadline, you can't negotiate it. But there are some things that you have an internal deadline for. And so when you set internal or personal deadlines, always make sure that what you're setting are things that are actually reasonable for you to achieve, given your season of life and other factors related to this. So this is a quick example I put together. I know examples are super helpful. But specific, say your goal is you want to increase the amount of times you're reading the Bible. So in this case, you want to consistently read the Bible 3 days a week as opposed to just 1 day a week that you're doing currently. Measurable, that one's pretty given. You'll know you're reaching your goal when you're actually reading your Bible 3 times a week. Attainable, this is important. So the reason why this person wanted, I just made this up. So the reason why 3 days is important is because if you take like a college student's schedule, you only have classes certain days. Well, if you have a gap, a half-hour gap every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's a really easy time to just slip in just reading the Word. And so that makes this goal attainable. There's already time carved out to do what they want to do. Relevant, the value is valuing my relationship with God and wanting to get to know Him better. So that provides a motivation to actually follow through. And then the timeline. This example, you know, starting at halfway through the semester, there's about 6 more weeks left. And so that gives you grace to be like, hey, some weeks I just might not get it done, and that's okay. But it gives you enough time that realistically you could consistently be building that habit of 3 times a week. So that's an example of how you would use SMART to do your goals. And the reason why I brought this up in the very first place is because the next thing that we're going to talk about is to-do lists. And sometimes the goals we have, they're just too big, they need to be broken down, and so they might end up forming a to-do list. And you know, sometimes guys, our to-do lists, they aren't related to a goal, they just might be things you have to do. When I walk through the homework, there's a couple of things on there that are related to goals, but there are a couple of things I just need to do. And so sometimes that is where a to-do list is helpful. So you filled out all your commitments on your planner. You have filled out this free time. You kind of have an idea using your list of things that you could do during that time. Your values are going to dictate kind of in what order you want to do them during that time. But honestly, guys, you might be thinking at this point, like, well, I'm sorry. You might be thinking, well, I've done this before, but I have yet to accomplish anything ever on these lists. And the reason why is usually one of two things. Life happens, and that's a very realistic and valid explanation sometimes for why we're not achieving the plans we have, and that might just mean we need to readjust our plans because life has thrown us a curveball we need to get through. The other thing is you just might not have good boundaries in place to support you sticking to your schedule, which is again why values are important. When you know what's important to your life, it's easier to form boundaries. And when I'm saying boundaries exist on the spectrum. You have boundaries that are really high stake, meaning they might have serious consequences if you cross it. You might have boundaries that are really low stake, meaning nothing really happens if they get crossed. You might have boundaries, on one end that no matter what, you can never cross that boundary. You might have boundaries on the other end where, well, if certain criteria are met, I can see it. So kind of, I know that's a lot to think of, so kind of an example I thought of in my life is a really low stake boundary that I have is just whenever I'm with other people, I really, really try not to text or be on my phone or anything like that. But there are cases where, for me, I find it okay to break that boundary. If it's an emergency, there are certain people who I know if they are calling me, the house is burning down and I need to pick up. And so I will pick up for those people. The other thing is if I'm just chilling with my roommates and we're watching a movie, I feel totally free to text people during that time. It's a casual thing, it's a long enough interaction, and they're probably texting too. So, it gives me freedom to do it right. But that's an example of a really low stake boundary, guys. You might come up with things that are more or less, but I love to think of boundaries for the most part. Most boundaries, there are things you just never ever cross, and those are walls. But most boundaries are fences with gates, and sometimes you open the gate, sometimes you shut the gate. And that's a good way to think of when you're thinking of your interaction with your priorities. There are things you value that you might put your walls up and be like, nope, we're not crossing. I value this thing too much. I have scheduled this time. I'm not rearranging. There might be other things, though, where you decide to open the gate and kind of rearrange life because you might value it more than other things. So if you ever get to a space where you're like, I just don't know, two things that are helpful. First off, no is a perfectly reasonable answer. It's also a complete sentence. So if something ever comes up where it just doesn't align with your boundaries or where you want to use your time, no is okay. It's an okay word to say. I know it's a hard word to say. I hate saying it. But in the end, it's not healthy or helpful to overextend yourself. Do you feel called out?
Yes.
Are there any of you?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's preaching to myself, Lou. The other thing is, again, guys, you might not have a clear idea of what you value, or you might not be valuing the things you say. Are you a 2-2?
What?
Oh, I thought you were pointing at yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. We can have a separate conversation later on the wonderful power of achieving boundaries and saying no when it sucks. But anyways, that was a little free tangent. But what we're going to do now is we're going to be adjusting into our homework period. And so the first thing you're going to do, if you didn't bring your values, is to write out your values. If you did bring your values, you want to take a moment to rank them. I would encourage you actually not to use this sheet yet, especially if you're still kind of brainstorming the things you value, because this is your final portfolio sheet. But again, write down the things you value, and then kind of rank them in order of importance to you. Again, this is a working document for now, and so there might be things you put down that you end up deciding later, like I did, I value this more, I value this less. So you're first going to take time to write out your values, rank them, and then I really encourage you to take a moment to just dialogue with your mentor about this. Why would you put certain things above other things? What makes that most important in your life over other things? The second thing that you're going to do is that you have a schedule and you have a to-do list sheet. And I want you guys to take a moment to first fill out your schedule with your commitments for this week. So for mine for this upcoming week, you can't see it super well, so if you want to come up and actually take a look at it, you're more than welcome to. But I listed down everything that I already have scheduled for this week. Again, I wasn't super detailed, like I don't have every step of my morning routine on this, because that's just something I get up and I go. But, you know, you might want to, if you're trying to develop a new morning habit, put that in. And then on the back of your sheet, so after you fill out the things on your schedule, take a minute again to kind of dialogue with your mentor. Are you okay with how much you have going on? Are there things you might want to be looking at putting on, taking off? Once you guys have digested your schedule for the next week, flip over and fill out some to-dos. And so I wrote this on Friday, and I have a little bit of time this weekend, and so I got some of this stuff done, but I still don't have all of it done. And some of these things, they are related to longer goals. Some of these things are just things I have to do. One of them is take my car into the shop. I have to take my car into the shop so Stanley keeps running. And so, you know, some of those things are just things you have to do. Some of them might be goals. So once you fill out your to-do sheet, again, you kind of have all the instructions for what I'm saying, because I know I'm going through everything super fast. Instructions for it right here on the other sheet you have. But again, chat with your mentor. What are things you need to do? What are things you want to do? And then finish with chatting about, you know, how realistic has it been in the past for you to achieve things on your to-do list? Why or why not may you or may not have had difficulty in the past? If you come to the conclusion that it's a boundaries thing, then talk to your mentor like, hey, using my values, how can I put boundaries in place to make sure I'm actually doing the things I value and I'm not just kind of being thrown every which way with whatever comes out of life. So you guys are going to have time to do that until about 8:20, and then we'll come back and I'll explain the homework to you guys because it's not very time intensive, but it will require you to stay on top of it. So before we dismiss, any questions for the good of the group? Okay, cool. I'll see you guys back here at 8:20 if you decide to go.